Hello there, guys. I thought we could continue our conversation about the Battle of the Washita. In case you missed part 1, we covered the leadership of Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer of the 7th Cavalry, as well as that of Chief Black Kettle, Southern Cheyenne, Council of 44 member, and leader of the Washita Part I band. We also touched upon the Indian raids of that summer and how they helped provoke the United States Army retaliatory campaign against the southern tribes. There were many captives taken by both sides of this fight, and they would play key roles in the campaign as it continued all the way till spring of 1869. Right now, though, let's pick up on the early morning snow-covered sleeping village of Chief Black Kettle, November 27th, 1868. Right as the 7th Cavalry is about to attack. Thanks so much for joining me. A recent blizzard had deposited a foot of snow over the area. In the middle of the night, amid freezing temperatures, the 7th Cavalry had gotten into position, surrounding the village as best as they could. Then, at dawn, a shot rang out from Black Kettle's camp. Custer suddenly signaled the charge by having the military band play Gary Owen, and the very trumpets froze to their lips. Following the opening of the attack, Custer set up a command post on a knoll overlooking the village. Major Joel Elliott led his companies, including Captain Frederick Benteen's H Company, to a position in the rear of the village. Captain William Thompson would lead companies B and F, which were meant to connect and close the loop on the other side with Elliott. Captain Edward Myers led companies E and I in the valley and timber. Now, this is an etching by the artist James E. Taylor, who is especially famous for his Civil War battlefield newspaper etchings. His brother fought at the Washita with the 7th, and this image is thought to be the most historically accurate, with guide-on military uniforms, etc. It's incredible how much Taylor is able to cram into this one image, and how appreciated this sort of art must have been before action photography or television. Captain Lewis Hamilton was the grandson of Alexander Hamilton, and he was riding next to Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. That's Custer. And he's wearing the winter apparel that he wore on this campaign. Captain Hamilton was fatally shot in the opening charge. A woman named Mawissa, reported to have been Black Kettle's sister, later told Custer that Chief Black Kettle was the first to hear the advance, that he leapt out of his lodge with his rifle in hand, uttered the first war whoops, fired the first shots as a rally to signal his warriors, and that he was shot down in the opening volley by the cavalry. The Osage scout, Trotter, claimed responsibility for killing Chief Black Kettle, and he said he had the scalp to prove it. But many of the Cheyenne eyewitnesses said Black Kettle was on his horse with his wife behind him, and that they were escaping the village when they were both shot. Native accounts say those bodies were later found in the river. So guys, this etching you see right there is Benteen's own copy of Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper dated December 1868. And that's Benteen's handwriting scrawled all over it. And if you can read the center there, that sort of like slanted line, Benteen wrote, "Sacatum Arti." And this is at the University of Georgia Frederick Benteen collection. The United States Cavalry certainly thought that the Washita was a fierce fight. Captain Francis Gibson wrote, "The battle raged with relentless and overwhelming fury." And Albert Barnitz would write, "The squadrons moved forward with a rush, and all was activity. The Indians were completely taken by surprise, yet they were instantly up and around. The fighting was severe." Barnett's, on horseback, chased down 2 warriors, shooting one and then shooting at another. He wrote that the second warrior was armed with a large Lancaster rifle given him by the Peace Commission. He took aim. However, I got quite close to him to fire, and he returned my fire at the same instant, both shots taking effect. He died almost immediately. Barnett's was also badly wounded in that shootout, and the bullet just missed his spine and intestines. Everyone assumed it would be fatal. He even wrote his wife a letter saying he loved her and he didn't know if he was going to see her again. But Barnett's lived. Benteen had a close call himself. Custer wrote in his memoir, Major Benteen, in leading the attack of the squadron, encountered an Indian boy. This boy rode boldly toward the major. His youthful bearing induced the major to endeavor to save him by making peace signs to him and obtaining his surrender. But with revolver in hand, he dashed at the major, leveling his weapon as he rose, and he fired. The shot whistled harmlessly by Major Benteen's head. Another followed in quick succession. A third bullet was sped on its errand, and this time to some purpose, as it passed through the neck of the major's horse, close to the shoulder, making a final appeal to him to surrender. But seeing him still preparing to fire again, the major was forced to self-defense, to level his revolver and dispatch him. Although he did it with admiration for the plucky lad, and regret often expressed that no other course under the circumstances had been left to him. The young warrior's moccasins were later recognized by his mother, and he was ID'd as the warrior Blue Horse, who was an adopted son of Black Kettle. Major Elliott would not be as lucky as his comrades. He spotted fleeing villagers and quickly recruiting 16 soldiers from Benteen and Meyer's companies. Elliott supposedly shouted, "Here goes for a brevet or a coffin," and he began to pursue the escapees. Here are some Cheyenne accounts of the attack. From Mrs. B.K. Youngbird, from her interview in 1937. She had been 14 at the time of the Washita fight. There was no warning. Up from our sleep we jumped. We did not have time to gather our clothing, just ran for safety in the best way we knew. I heard much firing all around us. I did not look to see whom it was that was doing all that firing, but we all knew that Longhair Custer was out hunting the Indians, and he had found us. We ran all our women folks and our girls and all of our children down to the banks of the Washita River for safety, but we found no safety. The soldiers were on both sides of the Washita River shooting a crossfire. There was no escape. We waded down the stream. Quite a few were shot down, and some escaped, I guess, by miracle. We could hear the women singing. They sang some war songs and some death songs, because all the men were now trying their best to defend us and themselves, and many were lying on the ground dead, and very many were wounded. A lot of little children were still barefoot, and lots of their feet were frozen. Magpie, who was 15 years old at the Washita, recalled in his own later interview, "There was little or no shooting at the soldiers in the village. The Indians did not fight back there. The soldiers started shooting into the village even before we could see them, and kept shooting everywhere, so flight was all the Indians were interested in." Mrs. Lone Wolf would say, "We all ran out of our teepee and tried to run through the narrow entrance. We saw white men in front of us motioning for us to go back. I fell on my face and could hear nothing but guns. At last the shooting stopped, and the next thing I knew, a soldier punched me with his gun and motioned me to get up. There were several other women lying close to me. Men, women, and children lay dead everywhere. I saw many warriors lying dead with their guns in their hands. I saw Major Elliott and a number of his men start down the river. I knew Major Elliott, as I had seen him several times before." Though the center of the village was taken in minutes, there remained pockets of resistance with scattered heavy fighting for hours. Around 10 a.m., Custer noticed warriors accumulating on a knoll about a mile from the village. Barnitz wrote, "It was surprising to see how soon, once the action had commenced, how all the hills were alive with mounted warriors, armed and equipped with shields and war bonnets." Custer had his interpreter, Romero, talk to a southern Cheyenne woman, Mowissa, who we're going to continue to hear about throughout. And she revealed that there was a succession of villages beyond. Nearly all the hostile southern tribes were represented, and these villages stretched out for the next few miles. Fortunately, for the 7th Cavalry at least, Custer had earlier told Quartermaster James Bell that the attack would be made at daybreak, and that Bell was expected to move forward as soon as he heard firing. Bell followed his orders exactly. During his headlong dash into the village, several of the wagon's wooden wheel hubs reportedly burst into flames from the friction. Wrote Francis Gibson, "Bell reached us in the nick of time, for had he delayed a few moments longer, he would have been effectively cut off by the hordes of Indians who took possession of the surrounding hills, and doubtless he and his little escort would have met the same fate as Elliott and his party. As it was, Bell had to fight his way through the timber skirting the Washita River, and had a number of mules killed before he reached us." The fighting continued on. Here's a description from Sergeant John Ryan. "Captain Benteen, with a detachment of 2 companies, divided into 4 platoons, made a charge. That was the prettiest sight I have ever witnessed, and while they were charging the Indians, we held our fire. The Indians were driven in great confusion, and I never saw troops in an engagement act in such a splendid manner or keep their line under such fire as these men did." As we mentioned earlier, Major Elliott, who was Custer's second in command at the Washita, spotted fleeing Cheyenne in the distance. He seemingly spontaneously decided to gather a small group of soldiers, and he charged away from the main battlefield in pursuit. This action would lead to the majority of United States Army casualties at the Washita fight. According to Cheyenne accounts, Elliott's party rode after a group of warriors, including Chief Little Rock, who you might remember from Part 1. He was the father of a Cheyenne woman named Monacita, and she's going to take on a greater role soon. That shield, the blue shield right there in the center that you see, that's actually Chief Little Rock's shield, and it was recovered after the Washita fight. So Major Elliott and his men chased down and killed Chief Little Rock, Blind Bear, as well as Little Rock's teenage son and Monacita's brother, Hawk. But 2 miles away from Black Kettle's village, Elliott was surrounded by warriors. Elliott's men were out in the open, and they took shelter in tall grass near a bend in a creek. More and more Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowa warriors joined in. The soldiers' horses were stampeded or killed, and the men lay down in a circle, and they fought until they ran out of ammunition. Scout Ben Clark, who was married to a Cheyenne woman and would spend much of his life living with the Southern Cheyenne, he later recounted native sources who told him the warriors, quote, "were charging like a whirlwind and rode down the troopers like they were blades of grass." And if Elliott had been less daring and retreated, he would have escaped, as the Indians were afraid to follow him. Here is another James E. Taylor etching, this time showing the death of Sergeant Major Walter Kennedy, who was found between the village and the Elliott fight site. Kennedy is thought to have been assigned by Elliott to escort some of the escaping Cheyenne women and children back to the 7th Cavalry at Black Kettle's camp. George Bent, a half Cheyenne man who lived with the Southern Cheyenne and documented their history and traditions, described this part of the battle. A Cheyenne woman called White Buffalo Woman had been running so long that the girl gave out. One soldier rode up to them and made a motion to walk back towards the camp. The soldier got off his horse and walked behind them. Just in front of them, a lot of warriors running from Black Kettle's village rode up out of the creek timber. The soldier fired at the Indians as they were charging toward them. This soldier shot at the warriors 2 times, and then a cartridge stuck fast in his carbine. Bobtail Bear rode up to the soldier and tomahawked him. Remember, General Sheridan's official order to Custer had been to proceed toward the Washita River, the supposed winter seat of the hostile tribes, to destroy their village and ponies, to kill or hang all warriors, and to bring back all women and children. Once the 7th Cavalry had secured the village, they rounded up all of the remaining women and children. They had taken 53 Cheyenne women and children prisoner. They also had captured about 875 ponies and a village full of supplies, food, and weapons. Custer also had wounded soldiers. He was surrounded by warriors on all sides and greatly outnumbered. He knew he couldn't secure all of the horses, and that if the Cheyenne managed to recapture their ponies, these horses would act as a method of escape or as future vehicles of war. Custer believed he had no choice but to commit what he himself described as a, quote, cruel but necessary act, and to kill a majority of the captured ponies. Chief Magpie would later describe the scene. From the top of a high ridge, I watched the battle and saw the soldiers burn the village and slaughter our ponies. This made the Indians very angry, and they would have attacked the soldiers had they not been afraid that such an attack would bring death to the women and children the soldiers had captured and were holding in the village. So right here, Magpie is pointing out how successful it was for the 7th Cavalry to have taken the Cheyenne women and children captives, and how this did indeed serve as a deterrent. Magpie also said, the loss that stirred the Indians more than any other was the wanton slaughter of their ponies. And as abhorrent as this seems to us today, the Cheyenne themselves were not above killing horses to keep them from falling into enemy hands, wrote one tribal historian about the warrior Redbird, who was shot during the Washita fight. Redbird was overcome by the troops and killed. A family member took aim and shot his warhorse that continued to stand by his fallen owner as he lay on the snow-covered ground. The horse fell beside Redbird, as it was the custom of the Cheyenne warriors to be with his warhorse Spirit in the journey along the Sayana to Meheho. This was also to ensure that the troops didn't get his fine horse. Ben Clark would later say that after killing the ponies, it was decided to burn the village, which consisted of about 75 lodges. There was an abundance of cooked buffalo meat and bread, which had been evidently prepared for war parties. Large quantities of powder, lead, and percussion caps were found. I noticed 4 white and 3 Indian scalps. Many buffalo robes and much clothing had been left behind. The village burned fiercely and made an intense heat, the Indians dancing and howling with rage at the sight. As the warriors from the other villages continued to gather and surround the 7th Cavalry, Custer had to figure out a way out of there. He came up with a daring plan. About an hour before sunset, he decided to move his troops in the direction of the accumulating braves, as if he was continuing his attack. Custer would write that he had the column move, quote, forward in one body, with colors flying and band playing. This feint worked. The warriors did not attack. Moving behind woman, who was watching the soldiers in the distance, said, "The soldiers are right across the river and are going slowly. Let's shoot them," someone suggested. Others said not to shoot for fear of hitting the Indian women who were being taken away by the soldiers. So whether the warriors did not want to risk harming the 53 Cheyenne women and children, or they wanted to protect their own villages, they did not ride out to meet the approaching column of United States cavalry, but instead raced back to protect their own families. Once it was dark, Custer immediately turned his entire column around, backtracked, and rode away under the cover of night. They escaped. Meanwhile, the survivors of Black Kettle's village who had gotten away were faced with tremendous loss. Black Kettle's daughter would later describe to her son, "All our horses were killed, and soon a great smoke of the burning teepee and everything we had for our winter use was all we could see. The snow was deep, and it was covered with the blood of our people and our ponies. My mothers and aunts mourned and unbraided their long hair and cut it short. Their cousins and other relatives were all gone, either killed or taken prisoners to Camp Supply. Then we moved toward the south, and our men chased buffalo to get hides for robes and shelter and meat. We suffered very much, but soon after we reached Texas." Now, the number of casualties remains one of the biggest controversies of the Battle of the Washita. There were 20 United States soldiers and officers killed that day. According to Custer's official report and other Army eyewitnesses, there were about 100 Cheyenne warrior dead. These accounts mention some women and children being killed in the crossfire, but they do not give account for them. Author and historian Jerome Green, who tallied all known accounts of Cheyenne fatalities, including that of George Bent, George Bird Grinnell, and Ben Clark, identified 40 warriors, 12 women, and 6 children killed. The Washita Battlefield National Park Service's official online count says that according to the Cheyenne and Arapaho Nation, there were 60 Cheyenne killed in total at the Washita fight. The 7th Cavalry and the Cheyenne captives arrived at Camp Supply on December 2nd, 1868. Here's a description from James A. Hadley of the 19th Kansas. "The splendid band of the 7th, playing Gary Owen to glory, came riding abreast as one platoon, their instruments flashing. Next came the prisoners, the widows and orphans of the murderous Black Kettle's band, riding their own ponies. Troop after troop marched with the precision of long service and perfect discipline. At the head of the column was a young man of medium height, slender, wearing buckskin hunting shirt and leggings much fringed. A worn hat with a broad brim surmounted a tangle of curling yellow hair reaching below his shoulders. Across his saddle he carried a long rifle, with which he was an expert. This was Custer at the age of 29. Custer's chain of command had been pleased with the results of the Washita fight. General Sheridan's General Field Order said, "The energy and rapidity shown during one of the heaviest snowstorms that has visited this section of the country, with the temperature below freezing point, and the gallantry and bravery displayed, resulting in the signal success, reflect the highest credit upon both the officers and the men of the 7th Cavalry. Special congratulations are tendered to their distinguished commander, Brevet Major General George A. Custer, for efficient and gallant services which have characterized the opening of the campaign against the hostile Indians south of the Arkansas." Now, you may have noticed that Sheridan just referred to the Battle of the Washita as the, quote, opening of the campaign. There was more to the Washita fight than just the battle itself. And though Sheridan seemed to think this was a signal success, not everyone was convinced. After a brief rest, the 7th Cavalry departed Camp Supply on December 7th. The 19th Kansas joined them, as did General Sheridan himself. An interesting selection of non-military personnel also joined the campaign. Now, if you remember in Part 1, we mentioned white captives who had been taken during the Indian raids in late summer, early fall of 1868. And it was those series of raids that caused the United States Army to go on the offensive. 3 women in particular were taken. Sarah White in August, an attack that left her father dead. Clara Blinn and her 2-year-old son Willie were cut off and seized from their wagon train in October. And lastly, Anna Brewster Morgan, who was kidnapped in October when she rode out to try and help her husband who had been attacked by warriors. Amazingly, Anna Brewster Morgan's brother, Daniel Brewster, came to where the 7th Cavalry was camped, and he asked Custer himself if he could have permission to join the campaign to look for his sister. And not only did Custer allow him to join them, but he gave Brewster a horse, a gun, and a paying job as a teamster. Custer also brought along 3 important Southern Cheyenne women captives that he had taken at the Battle of the Washita. The 20-year-old daughter of Chief Little Rock, Monacita, who we briefly mentioned earlier. Monacita may have been pregnant at this time, or she had recently had a baby, whom she would have left with the other Cheyenne captives at Camp Supply. Custer also brought the close relative or sister of Chief Black Kettle, Mawissa, who we also talked about a little bit earlier. And Mawissa had been acting as a spokeswoman for the Cheyenne captives ever since the 7th Cavalry had captured them at Black Kettle's village. A 3rd woman named Sioux Woman, who may have been Monacita's step-grandmother, also went. Custer chose these women who were well connected to chiefs, and these women acted as go-betweens between the U.S. Army and the Southern Cheyenne on more than one occasion. Said James Hadley, "These women exposed the secrets of the chiefs and knew much of value to the commanders. They knew all the secret hiding places also." And just a quick note, while we're talking about the 7th Cavalry taking and keeping Cheyenne women captives, this proved effective in curtailing raids. George Bent wrote of the Cheyenne after the Washita fight, quote, "The husband and relatives of these prisoners waiting on the chiefs of the tribes, and they asked that no war parties be sent out, as this would make the case of the prisoners worse, and for this reason no raiding was permitted." Custer left Camp Supply with a large contingent, 11 companies of the 7th Cavalry, 10 companies of the 19th Kansas Volunteer Cavalry, as well as White and Osage and Kaw Indian Scouts, with a rough total of about 1,500 people. They made camp a few miles outside of the battlefield on December 10th, and the next morning a small expedition went out to Black Kettle's camp. As this group drew near, reporter de Bonneville Kime wrote, "As we moved closer to the scene of death, suddenly lifting from the ground could be seen thousands of ravens and crows. The dense black mass passed overhead." The first battle site they found was that of Major Elliott and the other missing soldiers. They were all badly mutilated. Ben Clark wrote of the bodies, "Elliott had been greatly admired by the Indians for his bravery long before the fight. They remembered this when he was dead, and treated him as a valorous foe by severing his right hand at the wrists and his left foot at the ankle, leaving each attached by a tendon." The Army would also find the dead body of white hostage Clara Blinn, shot and scalped, and her 2-year-old son Willie, who seemed to have had his head bashed against a tree.
She was identified by the 19th Kansas, who lined up and walked past the bodies until someone recognized them. Clara Blinn's death would have an effect on the rest of the campaign and demonstrated that the Cheyenne would kill captives if their village was attacked. And if you'd like to learn more about Clara, I have an entire video about her, so please go and take a look at that. In addition to the white scalps mentioned earlier by Ben Clark and others, General Sheridan also reported that when the Army returned to the Washita battlefield, they found, quote, mules taken from trains, matter carried by murdered couriers, photographs stolen from the scenes of outrages on the Solomon and Saline, all were found in the captured camp. The 7th Cavalry and the 19th Kansas continued southwest to Fort Cobb. On December 18th, Benteen reported sick. It was here that Benteen wrote a letter to a friend and former Civil War comrade in Missouri. This letter, dated December 22nd, severely criticized the Washita fight, and it ended up being published in multiple newspapers. Here's an excerpt. Who can describe the feeling of that brave band, as with anxious beating hearts they strained their yearning eyes in the direction when help should come? What must have been the despair that, when all hopes of succor died out, nerved their stout arms to do or die? But surely some search will be made for our missing comrades. No, they are forgotten. Over them and the poor ponies the wolves will hold high carnival, and their howlings will be their only requiem. But interpreter Ben Clark would say, the charge was made against Custer in after years that he gave the order which led Elliott to his death and then abandoned him to his fate. This accusation was false. Custer knew nothing of Elliott's going. Half an hour after Elliott and his men rode away, Custer came up and asked me what had become of Elliott. The enmity between Custer and Colonel Benteen, which afterward grew very bitter, showed itself a day or two after the fight. Benteen, anxious to weaken Custer's prestige, came to me after it was believed that Elliott and his men were lost, and asked me if I would be willing to make the statement that Custer knowingly let Elliott go to his doom without trying to save him. I refused to have anything to do with that matter. I'm not sure if you guys can see this in detail, but that newspaper clipping right there is Benteen's own copy. And Benteen has written on it, who was fool enough to publish it, which implies that Benteen probably did not actually write this for publication, but meant it as a private letter to his friend. The campaign continued, and there were quite a few endeavors by the 7th Cavalry to convince other southern tribes to go onto their reservations. At one point, Custer seized the famous Kiowa warrior Setanta and Chief Lone Wolf, and threatened to execute them if their people did not move on to the agency. The Kiowa, to save them, complied. Wrote Custer, the Indian question, so far as the Kiowa were concerned, was regarded as settled, at least for the time being. Our next study was to effect a similar settlement with the Cheyenne, who had fled after the Battle of the Washita and were then supposed to be somewhere between the Wichita Mountains and the western border of Texas. After a few failed attempts, on the 2nd of March, 1869, Custer departed Fort Sill again with 11 companies of the 7th Cavalry and the 19th Kansas. But Custer is having a hell of a time finding the Southern Cheyenne. At one point, he sent out the Cheyenne woman captive Mowissa with an Apache chief, and she was supposed to go and find her people and then return to Custer with word of whether the Cheyenne would cease hostilities. Mowissa did not return. This is a map from Lewis Craft's book, Custer and the Cheyenne. Remember, many of these men had been campaigning since November of 1868. This part of the campaign was especially grueling. By the end, the men were reduced to eating horses and mules. and Custer was aware that he was running out of time. As soon as spring came, the Cheyenne ponies would gain their strength and offer the tribes greater mobility. Monacita continued to be valuable to Custer. Custer mentioned her role again and again in his memoir, My Life on the Plains, stating, "Monacita, in whom I had every confidence." And in another episode, he asks Monacita to examine an abandoned Indian camp. "I asked her to come tell me how long a time had elapsed since its occupation, how many constituted their party. No detective could have set about the proposed examination with greater thoroughness than did this Indian girl. Here and there were seen the bones of deer or antelope, which had been obtained by the Indians as food. These Monacita examined carefully, shattering them between two stones. The condition of the marrow seemed to point a particular importance in determining the length of time the bones had been lying in camp. Her conclusions were as follows. The lodges had left this camp not to exceed 2 weeks ago, and in all probability had moved to the rendezvous appointed for the main tribe, until the village would all be assembled at one point." And also it's interesting to note that Sergeant John Ryan says that Monacita could talk fairly good English. A few days later, Custer, nearing the Sweetwater Creek in Texas, rode out in front of his column and spotted 50 Indians ahead watching his progress. He wrote, "There was little doubt that it was the Cheyenne for whom we had been searching. I remembered the fate of the white woman and child held captive by a band of this same tribe at the Battle of the Washita. I knew that the first shot fired on either side would be a signal for the murder of the 2 white girls." Custer immediately rides out with only Lieutenant William Weiner Cook to strike up a conference before the rest of the U.S. troops arrive. The 7th Cavalry and the 19th Kansas had superior numbers and firepower. And remember, the 19th Kansas had been recruited from the very populace who had been victim to the earlier Cheyenne raids and depredations. They were ready for a fight. James Hadley sums it up in this way as they all neared the Cheyenne village. "The cold and hunger, the hardships of the winter, passed before these men, and the ample causes they had for the reprisals on their enemies. There was one picture that eclipsed all else in the heart of every man in that long, ragged, faded line from Kansas. The picture of a young mother lying dead on an army blanket, and in her arms a pretty little boy of 2 years old. Now is the time and the place." They could hardly believe their good luck. As the men gripped their repeating carbines, an officer came from Custer with an order to Colonel Moore. "Don't fire on those Indians." The men, stupid with wonder, were marched into the valley and halted. The men of the 19th, not knowing the reason for this and fearing their general had been tricked, were angry. Neither Custer nor Moore ever knew what a critical time it was. It looked at that time like they could not be restrained. The line officers argued, begged, and cursed. Meanwhile, Custer shook hands with the Cheyenne warriors who had ridden out to meet him, and then he followed them into the village with no one but his adjutant, Lieutenant Cook. Custer is brought into Chief Stoneforehead's lodge, who Custer calls Chief Medicine Arrows in his memoir, and under the actual Cheyenne sacred medicine arrows, Custer smokes the peace pipe. He has no interpreter with him. His interpreter, Romero, is way back in the rear of the column with the rest of the U.S. troops. So you can see how there were probably an awful lot of miscommunications going on during this conference. After the meeting, Custer returns to his column and they begin to set up camp. But the first person that Custer seeks out is Monacita. He writes, "I was still uncertain if the 2 white girls were captives in Medicine Arrow's village. I anxiously awaited the arrival of Monacita, who could and would solve this question. She came with the main body of troops, and I at once informed her whose village it was. To my inquiry, as to whether the 2 white girls were prisoners in Medicine Arrow's village, she promptly replied in the affirmative, and at the same time exhibited a desire to aid as far as possible in effecting their release.
Later on that day, about 50 braves rode into the cavalry camp with Chief Stone Forehead, and they proceeded to give a musical demonstration as well as a display of horsemanship. Custer had sent scouts out earlier to watch the village, and he thought this artistic show was an attempt to distract the army while the village packed up and prepared to flee. When the entertainment was finished, Custer would later write that the riding skills were superb. The warriors began to leave the army camp. Custer gave the signal, and soldiers stationed throughout the crowd seized 4 chiefs as hostages, including Chief Stone Forehead. This time, Custer had his interpreter, Romero, with him. Custer told the captured chiefs that he knew the village was holding the 2 white girl captives, and that he would hold the chiefs in order to force the freedom of the white girls and also to compel the Cheyenne to abandon the warpath and to return to the reservation. Maybe this was a lesson that Custer learned in 1867 at Pawnee Fork, when he found out that just surrounding a village wasn't good enough, for at Pawnee Fork the Cheyenne had slipped away in the night. Custer did free Chief Stone Forehead, and he told him to go back to his village and convince his people to free their white captives. 3 days passed, and the white captive girls were not surrendered, so Custer took the 3 chiefs he had captured to a cottonwood tree, threw a noose over its branches, and placed it around the throat of one of the chiefs. He said if the girls were not returned the following day, the chiefs would hang. Hanging was considered an especially abhorrent way for Cheyenne to die. They believed that when the windpipe was crushed, the spirit could not escape from the mouth at death, and it would be trapped in the rotting body for all eternity. The next day, before sunset, the soldiers saw figures in the distance. Wrote an eyewitness, "There were 2 persons on 1 pony. These were the women. The Indians brought them within 200 yards of the camp, where they slid off the pony and came down the hill, clinging to each other." Daniel Brewster, the brother of Anna Morgan Brewster, bounded away and was running at full speed to greet his long-lost sister. He clasped her in his arms, the taller of the 2 girls. Custer described the women. Mrs. White, the younger of the 2, though not beautiful, had an interesting face. Her companion would have been pronounced beautiful by the most critical judge, being of such a type as one might imagine Maud Muller to be. As I have been able to find no photos of Anna Brewster Morgan, this painting you see there is of the romantic heroine Maud Muller, whom Custer compared Anna Brewster Morgan to. Custer was very romantic. When passing the captured chiefs, Anna Brewster Morgan tried to grab a gun from a soldier and turn it on Chief Bighead, whom she said was the worst Indian in the whole tribe. And just as a side note, Chief Bighead was also implicated in being involved in the Kidder Massacre of 1867. Custer would hold on to these 3 chiefs. He said he would free them after the Cheyenne went to their agency. Custer would later write, "In obtaining the release of the captive white women, and that too without ransom or a loss of a single man, the men of my command, and particularly those of the 19th Kansas, who were called into service owing to the murders and depredations of which the capture of these women formed a part, feel more than fully repaid for the hardships they have endured than if they had survived an overwhelming victory over the Indians." Finally, the 7th Cavalry returned home to Fort Hays on April 7, 1869. Here, Monacita and the 3 captured chiefs
joined the other Cheyenne captives, who had been moved from Camp Supply and were living at Fort Hays in the post Stockade. The stockade was 186 feet long, 58 feet wide, with a 14-foot-high wall around it. There was also a mounted external guard platform built above so that the prisoners could be watched. Inside, the Cheyenne captives were living in lodges that had been taken after the Washita fight. George Custer brought his wife, Elizabeth, or Libby, to this stockade to meet the captives, as well as Monacita and her baby. Here is part of Libby's description. The enclosure was big enough to hold several large tents, yet leave a good-sized vacant place where the children could play. And this is what she wrote of Monacita. She was the princess, the ranking woman among them all, being the daughter of Chief Little Rock. During the winter, her intelligence and judgment had been of service in the attempts to bring the tribes to surrender. She was young and attractive, and the acknowledged belle among the Indian maidens. Monacita's face had the beauty of youth, whose dimples and curves and rounded outlines are always charming. Monacita let her blanket fall from her glossy hair. Her white, even teeth gleamed as she smiled, and the expression transfigured her. Libby also described Monacita's baby as a cunning little brown velvet bundle with bright eyes. Later that summer, there was a fatal misunderstanding. The infantry at Fort Hays tried to move the 3 Cheyenne chiefs out of the stockade. They didn't bring an interpreter, and the chiefs and the women thought they were going to kill them. Suddenly, mayhem broke out. A U.S. soldier was wounded, and the chiefs were shot, as were at least one woman captive. Monacita herself would find a bullet hole through her blanket. Chief Big Head, if you remember him, that's the man Anna Brewster Morgan, upon release, had tried to shoot and whom she said was the worst Cheyenne of them all. Chief Big Head was shot and killed. On June 13th, 1869, the Cheyenne captives were released. This is a painting called Goodbye Sally Ann by award-winning Western artist Jerry Thomas. Sally Ann was one of Monacita's nicknames. The Cheyenne captives were escorted with covered wagons and supplies, and they were brought to rejoin their people at their village near Camp Supply. It's quite a distance. Well, guys, all we have left are the Washita controversies, and there are a lot of them. Don't worry, I'm going to discuss those, just not here today, but I'm working on them. Stay tuned. They'll be coming soon. Thank you for joining me. As always, please subscribe, like, click the little notification bell. Please give suggestions, comments, anything you want. I'm usually really good about answering questions in the feed. Thank you. Thanks for hanging out. And thank you to my little Bighorn friends, especially Dale Cosman, George Cush, and Nathan Simon. Those gentlemen know a lot about the Washita and a lot about the 7th Cavalry and Native accounts as well, and I really appreciate the help they've given me. As usual, there's my book list. Take a look if you want to, I don't know, explore more on your own or curious where I got my facts. And if you have, again, any questions, put them in the feed. If you need better quotes, page numbers, etc., I'm always happy to provide that. All right, guys, I hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much. You're awesome. I appreciate, I don't know, getting a chance to talk about a subject I love. Thanks, guys. Bye.